Good morning to each one of you. Well, on behalf of UN Women, I really want to thank Casa Asia, the Network for Asian and Spanish Women, and ASIL for inviting us to be part of this really important meeting. And I want to really apologize for not being with you physically and in person because of unforeseen circumstances, but we are very much with you in spirit. We really do believe that this is a very important meeting because given the contemporary global village that we live in, this exchange of information, this partnership building, this unison in action is really critical more than ever if we want to transform the realities that we live in. And so against this background, or in the context of globalization and cross-border partnership, I would like to focus my remarks very briefly on trends in Asian women migrating for work. And I want to focus very briefly on the key trends, a very brief assessment of the mainstream discourse and practice on migration, and some suggestions for change. So to begin with, number one, women's migration for work is becoming a long-term, enduring structural feature in the Asian region as elsewhere. And this is pretty much rooted in the integration of markets, our economies, the changes in the relative shares of economic sectors, the division of labor, with a greater demand for women's labor, which is circumscribed by gender role and trait stereotypes, particularly for poor women in the informal service and manufacturing sectors. And as we know, all of us know, women tend to work in the export processing zones, in subcontracted flexi production sectors, in the informal sector basically. Secondly, what we are witnessing are changes in demographic patterns. With falling birth rates, we are witnessing a declining stable workforce, we are seeing the growth of an older population, and in contexts where middle-class women are being drawn into productive, in quotes, work or work outside the home, public paid employment, or where we have or do not have a shared culture of domestic responsibility, or where we do have or do not have public services that are geared towards childcare systems and providing for care work that could be done by working women. And in contexts, particularly contexts in richer societies, where there is a reluctance of host country nationals to engage in dangerous, dirty, degrading jobs, you see a demand for overseas domestic workers. And you have the service providers, employment service providers, ever alive, perpetuating and reinforcing flows across borders. Well, from the point of view of women who need to move, what we see is globalization and its unregulated market model of development are marginalizing women from access to jobs or decent jobs and education, which makes migration a survival strategy for large numbers of women. Also, in the context of natural disasters, complex emergencies, conflicts, you see traditional support systems breaking down and women fleeing for safety and survival with their children. Further, you have gendered practices, gendered cultural practices, gender-based violence that prompts women to move. Or you do have women moving because they're in search of broader horizons and more space for themselves. The second thing that we are noticing is larger numbers of women are moving. Now in Asia the proportion would be about 42%, but there are some countries in Asia, for instance the Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, where there are larger numbers of women than men who are moving across borders. Thirdly, women are moving independently for temporary periods of time, largely as a survival strategy. And this movement is facilitated movement, either by formal employment agencies or by informal social networks. Fourthly, they are recruited into women-specific jobs in the formal or in the informal manufacturing and service sector, but the largest concentration of our women is in domestic work or in the hospitality sector, where they face gross human rights violations. And most of these violations, as practitioners, we are aware of, and so I won't go into detail. But despite this violation, women contribute very, very substantially to development through the process of migration and through their work as women migrant workers. In countries of destination, they contribute by way of their labor, they contribute by way of their expenditures, their consumption, taxes, social security, benefits, and the like. And to countries of origin, they contribute very much by way of their social and their economic, their financial remittances. They are contributing to keeping families and communities alive in countries of origin. And we really don't have sufficient sex disaggregated data. But the little data we have garnered, and that's from Nepal, way back in 1997 is the data that we have, where women contributed about 11% of the 69 million Nepali rupiah that was remitted. And in the Philippines, for instance, about 1/3 of the $16 billion remitted annually. Now, this is substantial if you think of women who are concentrated largely in the informal sector, earning lower wages than men, and constituting the majority of undocumented persons and trafficked persons. The sixth trend that I'd like to focus on is that while capital and trade flows are liberalized, there are barriers erected to the movement of people, to transnational people flows, particularly the flows of women. And these are in the form of restrictive immigration and emigration policies. And many countries in Asia do have or have had either complete bans on women's out-migration or age-specific, occupation-specific bans, country-specific bans, which is a violation of women's right to movement and mobility, but also has exacerbated or created a fertile ground for irregular migration and trafficking. And these bans or these restrictions have been set up in the name of protecting women migrant workers, but have inadvertently led to them being disempowered. And then we have, of course, the majority of women who move either as irregular migrants or as trafficked persons. And much trafficking in most parts of the world, as in Asia, occur within the context of migration, either by manipulating the vulnerability of women or legal migration channels. But finally, I also want to say that despite this abuse, women actually garner and muster all their resources and actually move or transcend this exploitation and oppression. And we have significant examples of women who've actually individually or become part collectively of groups, of organizations, of associations that are struggling for gender equality and the empowerment of women migrant workers' rights. However, against this background, our mainstream discourse and practice on migration is not normally gender responsive, although it's often targeted at women and girls. Second, it is framed pretty much in the context of morality paradigms, sovereignty paradigms, security paradigms, law and order paradigms, and not a rights-based development, a sustainable development-oriented paradigm. Thirdly, we need more attention to be focused on the demand side of migration. Policies, practices of recruiting agencies in destination countries, for example. Fifthly, we need more attention to be paid to prevention of rights violations against women, either providing development alternatives to migration and providing women with the choice to migrate, or preventing of rights violations rather than a more concentrated focus only on rights violations or assistance post-rights violation. Oftentimes, when we do have preventive interventions, these are in the form of micro-livelihood projects which are not gender responsive or market responsive, and they only reinforce women's vulnerability to irregular migration and trafficking. Or we have preventive initiatives in the form of community awareness raising, and this is important. But we must also realize that this needs to be complemented and supplemented by very robust economic initiatives and interventions, because women must move if they need to move out of financial necessity. And finally, we do need a greater amount of collaboration, multi-sector collaboration between and within countries of origin, transit and destination. So finally, we have a huge amount to do to tackle this issue. And I just want to flag 4 important things from a whole menu of interventions or wishes that we may have. Number 1, it's important for us to have gender-sensitive, rights-based policies, legislation, plans and programs with strong gender-sensitive indicators and targets which are well-resourced if we need to make any difference to the lives of women on the ground. And to these policies, we must bring the voices of women from the ground in a sustained manner. These women must be present on institutionalized mechanisms to mainstream gender concerns into migration policies and plans. And these policies and plans also need to be built or grounded in strong research and evidence. Secondly, we require frontline services and social protection. And three key services that are often reiterated by women from the ground are information dissemination at all stages of migration, access to health insurance, and thirdly, asset building. So programs and initiatives that help safe transfer of remittances, women-friendly transfer and cheap transfer, convenient transfer, efficient transfer of remittances, and their productive investment in countries of origin. Thirdly, we need capacity building for targeted stakeholders. That's policymakers, service providers, and very importantly, women's organization, women migrant workers groups and their support organizations. And lastly, we need to change and transform the whole discourse on migration from one that is security and sovereignty centered to a gender-sensitive, rights-based development discourse. And here the media is extremely important, and our researchers and women gender equality advocates are critical to this initiative. Finally, I want to conclude by saying that UN Women has four important areas of work. That's peace and security, violence against women, leadership and governance, and women's economic empowerment. And within the context of women's economic empowerment, we are focusing very strongly on employment and decent work, social protection, migration, trade, and rural women. And we want to say that we have been formed as a result of a call from women's organizations on the ground, and we are strongly responsive to our constituency, to women on the ground. And so we want to pledge our commitment to work with you and forge stronger bonds of partnership with you in all the work we do, including the work of employment, decent work, social protection, migration. Thank you very much.